Liam's world was a fortress of polished glass and cold steel. From the 75th floor of his high-rise apartment, the city below was a sprawling tapestry of lights, but he saw only a vast, indifferent ocean. The view, a symbol of his hard-won success, had long since lost its magic. It was a constant, shimmering reminder of everything he had achieved and everything he was terrified of losing. The silence of the night, once a sanctuary, was now a cage. It was in this profound stillness that the thoughts came for him. They were relentless, sharp-edged, and whispered with the voices of his past failures and his future fears. Every tick of the clock was a tiny hammer blow against his sanity, counting down the seconds until another sleepless night would dissolve into a weary, fog-filled dawn. His body was a map of his anxiety. There was a constant, low-grade thrum beneath his skin, the ghost of a tremor that never fully went away. His jaw ached from clenching it, a subconscious defense against an invisible enemy. He had tried everything. There were the blue light-blocking glasses, the herbal teas, the meditation apps with their calming, robotic voices. He'd even consulted with doctors who, after running a battery of tests and finding nothing physically wrong, had offered him prescriptions he never filled. The idea of medicating his fears feeling like a surrender. He had always been a man who solved his own problems, who pushed through. But this was a problem without a solution. A phantom limb of dread that twitched and ached long after the day's work was done. His nights were a battlefield, and he was losing the war. He would lie in bed, rigid, his mind replaying every conversation, every decision, every potential mistake he had made. The mental film reel was endless, a torture chamber of his own making. He would get up, pace the length of... He wanted someone to talk to about the things that truly mattered, the fears that kept him awake at night, the vulnerable parts of him that he kept hidden behind a carefully constructed facade of confidence. But who could he trust with that? The very people he was in competition with? The thought alone made him retreat further into himself. His home was meticulously organized, a reflection of his need for control in a life that felt increasingly out of his grasp. The books on his shelves were alphabetized, the clothes in his closet color-coded. But the neatness was a lie. It was a paper-thin veneer over a chaotic mind. He would sit on the edge of his bed, feeling the weight of the silence, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical object. He would close his eyes, trying to force his mind blank, but the cascade of thoughts was unstoppable. They were like a rushing river, sweeping him away, dragging him to a place of deep, suffocating despair. He had become a stranger to himself, a hollowed-out version of the man he once was. Sleep was no longer a natural act of rest, but a privilege he had to earn, a prize that remained just out of his reach. He felt a desperate hunger for peace, a primal need to silence the noise in his head, to simply, finally, rest. It was a profound, aching need that drove him to the brink of exhaustion, a hunger for a stillness that felt impossible to achieve. The city below him was finally starting to dim, as if the world itself was tucking in for the night. But for Liam, the real night had just begun. Liam's success was a gilded cage, but the bars had been forged years before. His deepest anxiety wasn't born from the pressures of his career. It was the chilling echo of an old, profound loneliness. It had begun with the loss of his grandfather, a man who was more than a relative. He was a sanctuary. In a family that valued, he built walls instead of bridges, pushing away those who tried to get too close. He mistook professional relationships for genuine ones, and in the end, found himself surrounded by people but utterly alone. His phone, once a lifeline, became a device for business calls and superficial pleasantries, devoid of the deep, meaningful conversations he craved. The loneliness was a silent partner to his anxiety, feeding on it, and growing stronger with every new promotion and every quiet night. He had vivid, recurring memories of the last few weeks he had spent with his grandfather. There were the hushed hospital rooms, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and the way his grandfather's hand had felt so fragile in his own. He remembered the old man's eyes, still clear and full of a peaceful acceptance that Liam couldn't comprehend. His grandfather had spoken of faith, of an unshakable belief that transcended fear. He had tried to pass on a legacy of spiritual peace. But Liam, young and consumed by the world's clamor, hadn't been ready to receive it. He had seen it as a quaint, old-fashioned comfort, not a fundamental truth. He had promised to take care of himself, to be strong. But he now realized he had confused strength with isolation. He had mistaken emotional distance for self-reliance. The final story his grandfather had tried to tell him, a tale of a traveler finding home in the desert, had been left unfinished. It haunted Liam, a half-remembered metaphor for the journey he was now on, a journey he was navigating without a map. He had built a life that was technically perfect, but spiritually and emotionally hollow. The very foundation of his being, the sense of security and belonging his grandfather had provided, had been fractured, and he had spent his entire adult life trying to ignore the cracks. His ambition was a bandage over a gaping wound, and the anxiety was the constant, stinging reminder that the very act of trying to relax became an exercise in failure. He subscribed to newsletters from self-proclaimed gurus who sold secrets to a fulfilled life in glossy e-books. The advice was always the same. Wake up at 5 a.m., drink lemon water, journal your gratitude. Liam followed the steps with military precision, driven by his need for control, but the exercises felt hollow. His journal was a list of empty words, a chronicle of things he was told to be grateful for, rather than a genuine expression of his heart. The quiet mornings he was supposed to cherish became a new source of frustration. The sun rising on another day he had to face on the fumes of 3 hours of broken sleep. He was doing all the right things, but nothing was changing. The feeling of being a fraud, of performing wellness instead of actually achieving it, gnawed at him. He looked in the mirror and saw a man who had mastered the art of appearing calm, while his insides were screaming. The doctors had been a final, cold disappointment. They listened to his symptoms, the sleeplessness, the racing heart, the perpetual state of unease, and spoke in clinical terms. They offered him little pills that promised to mute the noise, to force his mind into a temporary peace. But Liam recoiled from the idea. He didn't want a chemical solution for a spiritual problem. He felt they were trying to put a band-aid on a gaping wound. They didn't understand the depth of his loneliness, the profound grief that had settled into his bones. They saw a high-functioning executive with a sleep disorder, not a soul crying out for meaning. He left their offices with a feeling of deep isolation, a confirmation that no one could truly see him, let alone help him. He was on his own in this battle, armed only with a collection of useless self-help books and a growing sense of despair. He had tried every trick, every technique, and the silence of his apartment felt like a crushing weight. Instead of pacing the living room, he found himself drawn to the small, forgotten attic he used for storage. It was a place he rarely visited, a dusty repository of his past. He wasn't looking for anything in particular. He was simply looking for a change of scenery, a new space to be miserable in. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, and the only light came from the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through a tiny, grimy window. As he rummaged through old boxes filled with his grandfather's belongings, a fragile, leather-bound book tumbled from a shelf and landed with a soft thud at his feet. It was his grandfather's Bible. He hadn't seen it in years, and the sight of it brought a sharp, unexpected pang of emotion. It was weathered and worn, the spine cracked, the pages thin and yellowed with age. He picked it up, feeling the cool, smooth leather against his fingertips, a tangible link to the man he had lost. For a long moment he simply held it, the weight of it in his hands feeling both heavy and comforting. He hadn't thought about his grandfather's quiet faith in a long time. It had always been a part of the man, a foundation he couldn't see but knew was there. He flipped through the pages, the paper rustling like dry leaves. His eyes fell upon a section labeled Psalms. He knew what they were, in a general sense. Songs and prayers from the Bible. The words themselves were not what captured him, but the faint, barely visible pencil marks in the margins, the underlined verses, the small, handwritten notes in his grandfather's familiar, looping script. It was a personal map of solace, a guide to finding peace that his grandfather had charted for himself. Liam felt a strange, almost illogical. How could these old verses, written thousands of years ago, possibly solve the problem that 100 sleepless nights and a dozen failed solutions could not? He read the first few lines, his voice a low, hesitant murmur in the vast silence of his apartment. Blessed is the man who walks not in the counsel of the wicked, nor stands in the way of sinners, nor sits in the seat of scoffers. The words felt distant, like an echo from a world he didn't understand. He felt a pang of a different kind of failure, the failure to even connect with his grandfather's last great comfort. But as he continued to read, something shifted. He came to the line, "But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and on his law he meditates day and night." The word meditates caught him. It was a term he recognized from his failed attempts at mindfulness. But here, it was framed not as an empty practice, but as an act of delight. It was a new perspective. He read the verse again, slower this time, letting the syllables roll in his mind. For the first time in what felt like forever, the frantic internal monologue in his head wasn't racing. It was still. He wasn't thinking about a failed presentation or a missed deadline. He was simply thinking about the words on the page. The silence he had so feared began to transform. It was no longer the empty, deafening silence of a hollow life, but a new, receptive quietness. He moved on to the next verse, reading about the man who is like a tree planted by streams of water that yields its fruit in its season, and its leaf does not wither. In all that he does, he prospers. The imagery was so vivid, so powerful. It painted a picture in his mind that his city life had never been able to. A tree with deep roots, planted by... He closed the book, the leather cool and reassuring against his palms. For the first time that night, he felt a flicker of something new. Not hope, not yet, but a strange, quiet sense of curiosity. A door had opened, and a soft, warm light was beginning to shine through. The old, leather-bound book became Liam's new constant. Every night, without fail, he would sit in his armchair, the city lights his only witnesses, and open the pages. The initial skepticism had faded, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent curiosity. He didn't understand why, but the words felt different. They didn't offer a quick fix, a 10-step plan, or a guru's empty platitudes. They simply offered a profound truth, an anchor in the storm of his mind. He began to explore the different psalms, letting his intuition guide him. Some nights he would read Psalm 23, its gentle assurance that the Lord was his shepherd, a voice of comfort in the dark valley of his anxiety. Other nights, he found himself drawn to Psalm 4, which spoke of lying down in peace and sleeping soundly, a promise that seemed to speak directly to his most desperate need. The change wasn't dramatic. It was gradual, like the slow, quiet unfolding of a flower. The first few nights, he still tossed and turned, but the moments of calm lasted longer. The frantic internal monologue would begin its race, but he now had a new tool to counter it. The rhythm of the verses, the memory of the words he had just read. His mind, so accustomed to fear, was slowly learning a new language, the language of peace. The physical tension in his jaw and shoulders began to ease. He would wake up, not feeling a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but a slight, subtle relief. The smallest glimpse of a good night's sleep. It was a fragile start, but it was a start nonetheless. The silence was no longer empty, but filled with the resonance of ancient prayers. The nights were no longer a battle he had to fight, but a time of quiet reflection and gentle surrender. He wasn't trying to force sleep, he was simply preparing himself for it. He would close the book, the familiar weight of it a final comfort, and lie down. A deep, restful calm settling over him like a warm blanket. His mind, once a roaring storm, had finally found its stillness. He had found a refuge that no self-help book or prescription could ever provide. He was finally, truly resting. The old instincts, buried beneath weeks of quiet ritual and peaceful sleep, roared back to life with a vengeance. The news from the company was a jolt of ice water, a cold shock that stripped away his newfound calm. A major client, a deal he had spent months cultivating, had pulled out. The reason was vague, a dismissive email that offered no explanation, and Liam's mind, accustomed to a quiet rhythm, was instantly seized by the old panic. He felt the familiar hot flush of adrenaline and the cold, sick twist in his stomach. The rational part of his brain, the one that had learned to find peace, was silenced by the primal, screaming fear of failure. He didn't go to his armchair that night. He didn't even think to pick up the old book. The idea felt ridiculous, a fragile, childlike comfort that had no place in the cutthroat reality of his business world. This wasn't a gentle sorrow that a few verses could soothe. This was a $5 million problem that demanded action, analysis, and frantic, all-consuming worry. He was no longer the man who meditated on a peaceful stream. He was a shark in bloody waters, and his old predatory nature was waking up. He reverted to his old coping mechanisms with a frightening speed. He worked through the night, his laptop a glowing portal to a world of spreadsheets and endless emails. He felt the loneliness return with a new, bitter edge. The world he inhabited was one of constant struggle and ruthless competition. There was no room for spiritual comfort, for soft promises of peace. He was an executive, a leader, a man who built his own fortress with his own hands, and the idea of relying on something as intangible as faith felt like a weakness he could no longer afford. He had been in a dream for a few weeks, a beautiful, peaceful dream. But now he was awake. He was back in the real world, and the real world was a place of endless struggle. He was alone again. But this time, the loneliness was not just a symptom of his success. It was a consequence of his choice to reject the only thing that had ever truly given him comfort. He was a castaway on an island of his own making, and the tide was rising. The city lights below had long since gone to sleep, but for Liam the night was a vast, unforgiving void. He was a man adrift, a captain without a compass. The frenzy of the past few days, the endless work, the phone calls, the furious attempts to salvage the deal had all amounted to nothing. He had crashed hard, the adrenaline gone, leaving him with an exhaustion so deep it felt like a physical illness. He was too tired to be anxious, too defeated to be angry. He simply was, a silent, motionless figure in the center of his opulent apartment. The cold marble of his kitchen counter felt solid and real under his palms as he leaned over it, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He had run out of fight. He had no more solutions to seek, no more battles to wage. He felt the presence of his grandfather's memory, like a physical ache in his chest. A profound wave of regret. "Grandfather, I'm sorry," he whispered, tears finally, mercifully, blurring his vision. "I'm so sorry. I didn't listen. I was so scared. Please, I just want to rest, just for a little while." He didn't know who he was talking to. His grandfather, a higher power he barely believed in, or maybe just the empty space in the room. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The prayer was a confession of his humanity, a complete surrender of his ego, his control, his pride. It was a release, a letting go of the need to be the perfect, successful man. For a long, long time, he just stayed there, on the cold floor, the weight of the world slowly lifting from his shoulders. He was not healed, not yet. But the storm in his mind, the constant furious wind of his anxiety, had finally found its calm. It was a stillness born not of peace, but of utter, complete exhaustion. He had surrendered. And in that surrender, a faint, trembling light was born. He had finally stopped fighting. And for the first time in his life, he was ready to listen. The exhaustion had a peculiar quality to it. It wasn't the bone-deep weariness of a man who had fought and lost, but the quiet, settling fatigue of a man who had finally stopped fighting. After what felt like hours on the cold floor, Liam slowly pushed himself up. He was a different man than the one who had collapsed there. His ego was gone, his pride shattered, and in their place was a clarity he had never known. The world didn't feel like a series of threats anymore. It felt like a reality he could finally face. Not with brute force, but with a new kind.
He saw his professional crisis not as a personal defeat, but as a test, an opportunity to put his new understanding into practice. He was no longer the man who had to solve every problem on his own. He was a man who could draw strength from a source that was infinite. The terror that had consumed him for days began to recede, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. He had faced the worst of his fears, the fear of losing his control, and had survived. And in that surrender, he had found a courage he never knew he possessed. He thought of his grandfather, and for the first time, the memory didn't bring sadness, but a deep sense of gratitude. He understood now. The peaceful acceptance in his grandfather's eyes hadn't come from a life without trouble. It had come from a life that had found an anchor in the storm. Liam knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The deal was still lost. The company was still in a precarious position. But the battle was no longer an internal one. The frantic race in his mind had stopped. He was armed with a new kind of wisdom, a strength that was not born of his own effort, but of a quiet, abiding faith. He stood up from his chair, a new purpose burning in his chest. He was ready to face the world again, not as a panicked soldier, but as a man who had found his refuge. The morning after his surrender, Liam walked into his office a different man. The polished suit was the same, the view from his window still a sprawling testament to his ambition, but his inner world had been completely rearranged. He felt no frantic urgency, no cold dread. Instead, there was a quiet, unshakable resolve. He sat at his desk, and instead of opening the email chain of the failed deal, he simply sat in the quiet of his office and took a deep, steadying breath. He wasn't ignoring the problem. He was approaching it from a place of peace, not panic. His mind, so accustomed to racing, was now a still pool of... He was no longer reacting to every minor setback with a clenched jaw and a sharp word. He was listening more. His answers were thoughtful, and he moved with a purpose that was calm, not frantic. The fear that he had carried for years, the deep-seated worry of losing control, had been replaced by an inner stability. The crisis at work was still a reality, but it no longer held a death grip on his soul. He saw it as a temporary condition, a challenge to be faced, not a personal failure that defined his worth. He was still a leader, but he was leading from a place of courage, not of fear. The anxiety had not disappeared completely, but it was no longer in the driver's seat. It was a distant passenger, a quiet reminder of where he had been, and a motivation to never return. That night, when he returned to his apartment, he did not feel the weight of a long day. He felt a deep, earned fatigue. He went to his armchair, picked up his grandfather's book, and opened it to a new psalm. He read it not as a desperate act, but as an act of communion, a continuation of the peace he had found. He understood now that the spiritual journey was not separate from his real life. It was the very foundation of it. The peace he had found in the Psalms was not just for the quiet of the night. It was for the chaos of the day. It was the well from which he could draw his strength, a source of courage that would never run dry. The astonishing change was not just in his sleep, but in every single moment of his life.
Liam's transformation went beyond his sleep and his professional life. It had begun as a desperate quest for rest, had evolved into a search for strength, and was now blossoming into a profound connection with his true self. He realized that for years he had been living a life defined by other people's expectations and a society's metrics for success. He had chased titles and wealth, not because they brought him joy, but because he believed they were the keys to happiness and worth.
He had finally embraced the idea that his worth was not measured by his accomplishments, but by the quiet peace in his soul. The journey had also brought him a deeper understanding of his grandfather's legacy. He had mistakenly thought the man had left him a lesson on how to cope, but he now understood it was a lesson on how to live. The Book of Psalms wasn't just a sedative. It was a guide to a life of gratitude, purpose, and unshakable faith. His nightly ritual became a conversation with the divine, a time to give thanks for the small mercies of the day, and a moment to surrender the worries of the future. He wasn't praying for things to get better. He was praying to be a better man, one who could face whatever came his way with grace and courage. His life was no longer about climbing a ladder to a lonely rooftop, but about building a foundation of peace from which he could reach out and connect with the world. He felt a fullness he had never known before. His apartment, once a sterile fortress, was now a home filled with peace. His work, once a source of constant stress, was now a meaningful part of a larger, more authentic life. The emptiness that had driven him to such a desperate state was gone, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. He was no longer running from his fears. He was walking with them, acknowledging them, and moving forward anyway. He had come to understand that true strength wasn't about having no weaknesses, but about having the courage to face them with faith. He had connected with the truest part of himself, and in doing so, he had found the key to a lasting, internal peace. The resolution of the business crisis was not a spectacular victory, but a testament to a quiet, profound change. Liam didn't salvage the lost deal through aggressive negotiation or a power play. Instead, he approached the client with a sense of calm integrity, offering to help them transition to their new partner, demonstrating a grace and professionalism that astonished even his own team. The client, taken aback by his unexpected maturity. He was still the same person, but the fear that had once defined him had been replaced by a quiet confidence. He was no longer trying to prove his worth. He was simply living it. He had found a sense of community he had not even known he was missing. He also found a new kind of purpose. The empathy he had discovered was not just a feeling, but a calling. He saw the same anxieties he had once battled reflected in the eyes of his colleagues and friends. He began to offer quiet counsel, not from a place of superiority, but from the humble experience of a man who had hit rock bottom and found his way back. He would sit with a junior analyst struggling with a presentation, not to offer a strategic fix, but to listen to their fears and offer a few simple words of encouragement. He began to understand that true leadership wasn't about commanding, but about serving. His spiritual journey, which had started with a book, had led him to a place of profound compassion. He was no longer just a high-powered executive. He was a mentor, a confidant, a source of peace for others. He had realized that the most powerful thing he could do with his story was to share it, not to boast of his triumph, but to offer a beacon of hope to anyone lost in their own darkness. The quiet victory was not about what he had achieved in his career, but about the man he had become. He was whole. The gaping wound from the loss of his grandfather had not been forgotten, but it had finally healed, leaving behind a scar of wisdom and strength. He had not only found his way back from the brink of despair, but had been fundamentally transformed by the journey. He had truly been reborn. Liam's personal triumph became a quiet mission. The clarity he had found, the peace that had settled into his soul, felt too profound to keep to himself. He knew there were countless others, just like the man he used to be, lying awake in the dark, trapped in their own fortresses of fear and loneliness. His grief for his grandfather. He began to share the old stories and prayers in a world that was hungry for something real. He gave his channel a name that felt right, one that spoke to the gentle peace he had found, and he uploaded his first video. He didn't tell his colleagues or his friends. This was not an act of self-promotion. It was an act of service. He was simply offering what he had been given. He didn't care about the view count or the number of subscribers. The first video had a single viewer. Him. He listened to his own voice, hearing not just the words, but the journey that had brought him to this moment. The story was in the silence between the verses, in the subtle change in his tone. The fear that had once clung to him like a shadow was replaced by a sense of profound fulfillment. His heart, once hollow, now felt full. He was no longer a consumer of peace, he was a creator of it. He was a beacon, shining a light on a path he had walked himself. He began to receive a few comments, messages from strangers around the world who had stumbled upon his quiet corner of the internet. They spoke of their own struggles with anxiety, with sleeplessness, with a sense of being lost. They thanked him, not for a solution, but for a presence. They told him that his voice, his gentle, steady voice, had helped them finally find a moment of peace. He realized that this was the truest form of success. It was not in the number of zeros in his bank account, but in the number of souls he had touched. He had finally fulfilled the purpose he had been searching for all along. He was a living testament to the power of a quiet faith, a man who had found peace by giving it away. The sun set, painting the city in hues of gold and lavender. But Liam was no longer a prisoner to the night. He had navigated the storm of his past and the chaos of his present. And now, he was simply at peace. He was a tree, deeply rooted, and the winds of the world no longer had the power to shake him. When he finally lay his head on the pillow, it was not with a mind full of dread, but with a heart full of peace. The thoughts still came, as they always would, but they were no longer a roaring flood. They were like gentle streams, and he was the quiet ground, unmoving and secure. He would simply acknowledge them, and then, with a simple, quiet trust, let them go. The rest that came was deep and profound, a healing sleep that restored not just his body, but his soul. He would wake feeling refreshed and whole, ready to face the world not with a prepared defense, but with an open heart. His journey was a testament to a simple truth, that the peace we so desperately seek is not found in external victory or a perfectly curated life. It is found in surrender, in vulnerability, and in a profound connection to a source of strength that is not our own. He had not just learned to sleep. He had learned to live. He was no longer a man defined by his accomplishments, but by the quiet, unwavering peace that resided within him. The story of his trudge through the darkness had ended. The story of his life, lived in the light, had just begun. He was finally, truly, home.